Bloodlines meant everything in the northern valleys, but a single spoken syllable was about to shatter a centuries-old dynasty. For 4 agonized years, the Alpha King's heir had been entirely mute, a silent phantom haunting the stone corridors of Ethelgard Castle. The realm's finest healers and wisest elders had tried and failed to pull a voice from the boy. Yet, when a visiting lord moved to humiliate a broken, rejected Omega servant before the royal court, the curse of silence broke. The little prince did not cry or cower. He marched forward, pointed a defiant finger at the lowly scullery maid, and brought the entire kingdom to its knees with one impossible word: Mama. The cobblestones of Ethelgard Castle were always freezing, even in the meagre warmth of the late spring sun. Adelaide scrubbed at the dark grout with a bristled brush, her knuckles raw and bleeding from the lye soap. She was 22, though the heavy lines of exhaustion around her pale blue eyes made her look far older. In the rigid hierarchy of the lycanthrope world, an Omega was already considered the lowest rung of the ladder. Fragile, submissive, meant only to serve and breed. But a rejected Omega was something far worse. They were outcasts, bad omens, ghosts breathing stolen air. 3 years ago, Adelaide of House Mercer had stood before the sacred moon pool, her heart fluttering with the hopeful naivety of youth, only to have her fated mate, Lord Cedric of the Ironwood Pack, look at her with unvarnished disgust. "I am an alpha of war," Cedric had announced to the gathered crowds, his voice echoing off the ancient pines. "I will not anchor my legacy to a weak, trembling Omega, whose wolf barely has the strength to howl. I reject you, Adelaide Mercer." The agonizing severance of the mate bond had nearly killed her. Her family, deeply humiliated by the public rejection, had stripped her of her surname and exiled her. Desperate, starving, and with a shattered soul, she had travelled on foot to the royal capital, begging for any labour that would keep a roof over her head. She became a nameless scullery maid in the kitchens of King Alaric, the most feared and powerful alpha in the known realms. King Alaric was a sovereign forged in blood and tragedy. He had united the warring territories of the West through sheer, terrifying brutality, but his conquests had cost him dearly. His queen, a beloved alpha female of noble birth, had perished during childbirth 4 years prior. She left behind a kingdom in mourning and a single heir, Prince Leo. But the moon goddess had a cruel sense of humour. The boy, carrying the purest alpha blood in generations, was profoundly mute. Since the day he drew his first breath, Prince Leo had not made a single sound. He did not cry when he scraped his knees. He did not laugh when the court jesters tumbled for his amusement. He simply watched the world with large, hauntingly intelligent green eyes, his father's eyes. The royal council, led by the calculating elder Lord Harrington, whispered that the boy was cursed, a broken vessel unfit to inherit the throne. They pressured King Alaric daily to take a new mate, heavily pushing for Lady Genevieve of the wealthy Beaumont estate to produce a proper heir. Adelaide kept her head down, avoiding the vicious politics of the highborn wolves. Her only solace was the rare glimpses she caught of the silent prince. It happened on a Tuesday, while Adelaide was polishing the grand mahogany banisters of the eastern wing, a section of the castle strictly forbidden to the lower servants during daylight hours. She had been sent there as a punishment by the head housekeeper. As she knelt, rubbing beeswax into the wood, she heard the rapid, silent patter of small feet. Prince Leo rounded the corner, his small chest heaving, his dark curls plastered to his forehead with sweat. He was fleeing. A moment later, the sharp, clacking footsteps of Lady Genevieve's leather boots echoed down the corridor. "Leo, do not be a difficult child." Genevieve's voice was sharp, dripping with a venom she carefully hid whenever the king was near. "Come here at once. The king expects us to walk the gardens together." Leo's eyes darted frantically. He spotted Adelaide kneeling by the stairs. Without a moment's hesitation, the 4-year-old prince dove behind Adelaide's voluminous, ash-stained skirts, curling into a tight ball against her trembling legs. Adelaide's breath hitched. To touch the royal heir was an offence, punishable by the lash. But her inner wolf, battered and dormant since her rejection, suddenly stirred with a fierce, warm instinct. She shifted her body just slightly, fully shielding the boy from view as Lady Genevieve swept into the hallway. "You there!" Genevieve snapped, her expensive silk gown rustling ominously. She sneered at Adelaide's ragged appearance. "Omega, did a boy run past you?" Adelaide kept her eyes glued to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She bowed her head lower. "No, my lady. I have seen no one. I have only been looking at the wood." Genevieve scoffed, a sound of pure disdain. "Useless creature. If you see him, you are to alert the guards immediately. He is practically feral." She spun on her heel and marched away, her scent of heavy rose perfume lingering sickeningly in the air. Once the hallway was empty, Adelaide slowly lifted her skirts. Leo looked up at her, his green eyes wide and cautious. Adelaide did not speak. She knew the boy hated being fussed over. Instead, she reached into her apron and pulled out a small, slightly bruised apple she had saved from her meagre breakfast. She polished it on her sleeve and offered it to him. Leo stared at the apple, then at Adelaide. Slowly, his tiny, dirt-smudged hand reached out and took it. He didn't smile, but he reached up and placed a small, warm hand flat against Adelaide's cheek for a fleeting second before darting away down the servants' corridor. Adelaide touched her cheek, her skin burning where the little prince had touched her. It was the first time in 3 years someone had touched her with something other than cruelty. The great hall of Ethelgard Castle was a vision of medieval opulence. It was the night of the winter solstice, the most sacred holiday in the lycanthrope calendar. Thousands of candles floated in iron chandeliers, casting a golden glow over roasted boars, wheels of imported cheeses and flagons of spiced wine, banners of deep crimson and silver, the colours of King Alaric's bloodline, draped from the towering stone walls. Adelaide was terrified. Due to a sudden bout of winter fever sweeping through the servants' quarters, she had been drafted from the kitchens to serve wine in the main hall. She was dressed in a clean but coarse, grey woolen dress, her hair pinned back tightly. Her sole objective was to remain invisible. But fate, it seemed, was not done punishing her. Seated near the head table, right below the king's raised dais, was Lord Cedric of the Ironwood Pack. He had grown broader, his beard thicker, and his aura arrogant. He was attending the solstice feast to negotiate a trade treaty with the crown. Beside him sat his new mate, a stunning, fiercely confident alpha female. Adelaide kept to the shadows, refilling goblets at the lower tables, her hands shaking so badly she feared she would drop the heavy silver pitchers. But an Omega's scent, subtle, sweet, and laced with the bitter tang of a broken bond, is hard to hide from a wolf who once held it. As Adelaide stepped forward to clear a platter near the middle tables, Cedric's head snapped up. His nostrils flared, his eyes locked onto her, and a cruel, predatory grin spread across his face. "Well, well," Cedric's booming voice cut through the ambient chatter of the surrounding nobles. "I thought I smelled something pathetic." Adelaide froze, the blood draining from her face. She bowed her head, clutching the silver platter to her chest, praying he would let her pass. "Look here, my lords," Cedric laughed, standing up and stepping into the aisle, blocking her path. "The great Ethelgard Castle employs the trash of the Ironwood Pack. Tell me, Adelaide, do you still weep for a bond you were too weak to hold?" Silence began to ripple outward from Cedric's table. In Lycan culture, a rejected mate was a taboo subject, a mark of deep shame. To bring it up at a royal feast was a gross breach of etiquette, but Cedric was an alpha, drunk on wine and his own perceived importance. At the high table, King Alaric's eyes narrowed. The king was a terrifying figure of a man, broad-shouldered, clad in dark leather and steel, with a thick, dark beard and eyes like shards of green ice. His presence alone commanded absolute submission. Beside him, Lady Genevieve sat rigidly, trying to maintain her serene smile while glancing nervously at the king's darkening expression. "Let the servant pass, Lord Cedric," King Alaric rumbled, his voice low, but carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of his alpha command. "This is a feast of the solstice, not a tavern brawl." Cedric bowed mockingly. "Apologies, my king. I merely recognized a stain from my past. It offended my mate to see such a lowly, rejected Omega walking among your noble guests." He turned back to Adelaide, his eyes flashing with sudden malice. "Kneel, Omega. Apologize to my mate for polluting her air." Adelaide's knees hit the cold stone floor instantly. Her wolf, broken and submissive, gave her no choice against an alpha's direct command. Tears hot with shame pricked her eyes as the entire hall watched her humiliation. "Forgive me, my lord. Forgive me, my lady," she whispered, her voice trembling. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the high table. Prince Leo, who had been sitting silently in his high-backed chair, abruptly scrambled down. His small face was twisted in an expression of absolute, terrifying fury, an expression so painfully identical to his father's that several nobles gasped. "Leo, no! Come back here!" Lady Genevieve hissed, reaching for the boy's collar. But Leo snapped his teeth at her hand, a genuine feral warning that made her recoil in shock. The small prince marched down the steps of the dais. The great hall fell into a deathly silence. Even Cedric stepped back, confused, as the 4-year-old boy strode purposefully down the center aisle. Leo stopped directly in front of the kneeling Adelaide. He turned his back to her, facing the towering, heavily muscled Lord Cedric. The boy squared his tiny shoulders, raised his chin, and let out a low, rumbling growl from deep within his chest. It was a sound that shouldn't have been possible for a child his size. Cedric let out a bark of uneasy laughter. "A fierce protector. It seems the mute prince has found a stray to play with." The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. King Alaric stood up, his chair scraping violently against the stone. His eyes flashed gold, his alpha aura exploding into the room, pressing down on everyone's lungs. "Mind your tongue, Cedric," Alaric snarled. "Step away from my son." "Of course, my king," Cedric sneered, though sweat beaded on his forehead. He looked down at Adelaide. "Get up, Omega. You're causing a scene. Disappear before I have you whipped for ruining the feast." Adelaide scrambled to obey, terrified of the king's wrath, terrified of Cedric, terrified of the danger the little prince had put himself in. "I am sorry, Your Highness," she wept quietly, trying to gently step around Leo to flee to the kitchens. But Leo grabbed handfuls of her grey skirts. His grip was astonishingly strong. Adelaide stopped, looking down at the boy in panic. Leo did not look at Cedric. He did not look at his father. He looked up into Adelaide's tear-streaked face. His chest heaved. His small jaw worked, the muscles straining as if fighting a physical battle invisible to the rest of the room. The silence in the hall was so profound that the crackle of the hearth fire sounded like thunder. Leo lifted a single trembling finger and pointed it squarely at Adelaide's chest. He drew in a deep breath, and a sound, hoarse, unused, and overwhelmingly clear, tore from his throat. "Mama." A heavy silver goblet slipped from Lord Harrington's hand and clattered deafeningly onto the stone floor. Lady Genevieve let out a strangled gasp. King Alaric froze entirely, his golden eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock. For 4 years, he had prayed to the moon goddess, offered sacrifices, and emptied his treasury for just one word from his son. And the word had finally been spoken. Not to him, not to the highborn lady meant to be his new queen, but to a broken, rejected Omega kneeling in the dirt. Chaos did not erupt. Rather, a suffocating, terrifying paralysis gripped the great hall. The word hung in the air, echoing off the ancient vaulted ceilings. "Mama!" Adelaide stopped breathing. She stared down at the little boy clutching her skirts, her mind completely blank. "This is a dream," she thought frantically. "A cruel, twisted nightmare born of my own grief." But the warmth of Leo's small hands, gripping her coarse woolen dress, was undeniable. "Leo," King Alaric's voice broke the silence. It was not the booming command of an alpha king, but a fractured, breathless sound of a desperate father. He descended the dais in 3 long strides, the heavy silver clasps of his cloak jingling in the quiet hall. The crowd parted for him, as if he were Moses dividing the sea. Alaric dropped to one knee before his son, completely ignoring Cedric, who was now pale and trembling at the edge of his vision. The king reached out with large, scarred hands, grasping his son's shoulders gently. "Leo, speak again. Look at me, little wolf. Speak again." Leo looked at his father. The boy's expression was stubbornly resolute. He did not speak. Instead, he took half a step backward, pressing himself more firmly against Adelaide's legs, and scowled at the king. Alaric's gaze slowly dragged upward, travelling past his son's dark curls, up the coarse grey fabric of the servant's gown, until his eyes locked onto Adelaide's face. Up close, the Alpha King was overwhelming. His scent, pine needles, sharp winter air, and the metallic tang of fresh snow wrapped around Adelaide, making her battered inner wolf whimper in submissive terror. "You," Alaric rumbled, his green eyes searching her terrified face, cataloguing her hollow cheeks, her trembling lips, the undeniable scent of a severed mate bond. "What is your name?" Adelaide, your majesty," she stammered, dropping her gaze instantly. "I am sorry. I don't know why I have never—" "Silence," Alaric commanded softly, though not unkindly. He stood up to his full, towering height. He looked over at Cedric, his eyes hardening into flint. "Lord Cedric," Cedric bowed hastily, swallowing hard. "My king." The boy is confused. The Omega clearly used some parlor trick, some low magic to— "If you finish that sentence, Ironwood, I will rip your tongue from your throat and feed it to the hounds," Alaric stated, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "You will leave my hall. You will leave my lands. The trade treaty is void. If I see your banners within 50 miles of Ethelgard before the next moon, I will consider it an act of war. Go." Cedric opened his mouth, saw the murderous gold flaring in the king's eyes, and wisely shut it. He turned and practically fled the hall, his new mate scurrying after him. The king turned to the captain of his guard, a massive, scarred wolf named Silas. "Clear the hall. The feast is over." "Sire," Lord Harrington interrupted, stepping forward from the high table, his ornate robes rustling. "The solstice feast cannot be abandoned. And what of this incident? The boy is clearly disturbed. To call an Omega out—" Alaric turned his head slightly, glaring at the elder. "Did you not hear me, Harrington? Clear. The hall." Within minutes, the magnificent great hall was empty, save for the king, the prince, Adelaide, and Captain Silas, standing by the heavy oak doors. Lady Genevieve had tried to stay, protesting that she should comfort the prince, but a single warning growl from Alaric had sent her packing with the rest of the nobles. "Come," Alaric said to Adelaide. It wasn't a request. He turned and strode toward the private wing of the castle. Adelaide stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. It was Leo who tugged on her hand, looking up at her with those soulful green eyes, urging her forward. With a trembling breath, she followed the Alpha King, her hand enveloped by the tiny, warm grip of the prince. They entered the king's private study, a massive room lined with ancient tomes, maps of the continent, and a roaring fireplace. Alaric walked over to a heavy oak desk and poured himself a goblet of dark liquor. He downed it in one swallow, staring into the flames. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a plush velvet chair near the fire. Adelaide hesitated, then perched on the very edge of the seat, pulling her knees together. Leo immediately climbed up next to her, wedging himself between her hip and the armrest, resting his head against her arm. He closed his eyes, visibly exhausted from his outburst. Alaric turned around, leaning against his desk. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, his gaze heavy and calculating as he watched the two of them. 4 years, Alaric said, his voice quiet in the cavernous room. I have brought priests from the sunless citadel. I have had witches from the boglands brew tonics. I have spent nights on my knees in the snow, begging the moon goddess to let me hear my son's voice just once. He tilted his head. And he speaks for a scullery maid who was cast out by a petty lord of the ironwood. Adelaide swallowed the lump in her throat. I swear to you, my king, I did not teach him to say it. I have never spoken to him. He hid behind me once in the corridor, and I gave him an apple. That is the entirety of our interaction. Alaric's eyes narrowed slightly. An apple. Lady Genevieve she was yelling for him, Adelaide whispered, terrified of speaking ill of the king's intended, but unable to lie under the weight of his stare. He was frightened. He hid. A dark shadow crossed Alaric's face at the mention of Genevieve. He rubbed his jaw, studying Adelaide. He could smell her fear, but beneath it, his highly attuned alpha senses picked up something else. Since his queen died, his own wolf had been a dormant, grieving creature, uninterested in anything but war and protection. But as he stood in the room with this pale, broken Omega, his inner beast was pacing, intrigued by her resilience, inexplicably drawn to the gentle way she subconsciously rested her scarred hand on his son's dark hair. Cedric rejected you, Alaric stated bluntly. It wasn't a question. Adelaide flinched, the old wound aching. Yes, Your Majesty. 3 years ago. He said I was too weak. Alaric let out a low, humorless scoff. Cedric is a fool, blinded by ego. A weak wolf does not survive the severing of a mate bond. A weak wolf dies of a broken heart. You survived. You walked from the Ironwood territory to Ethelgard. You have endured. He uncrossed his arms and walked slowly toward the fireplace, stopping just a few feet from her chair. He looked down at his sleeping son, then back to Adelaide. The council demands I take a new mate, Alaric said, his voice dropping to a low register that sent a shiver down Adelaide's spine. They demand I give Leo a mother. They parade high-born alphas and betas in front of me, women who look at my son not as a child, but as an obstacle to their own future power. He leaned down, bringing his face level with hers. His green eyes held a terrifying intensity. My son has spoken. He has made his choice. And an alpha king doesn't ignore the will of his heir. Adelaide's heart stopped. She stared at him, unable to comprehend the words. Your Majesty, I don't. Effective immediately, Alaric declared, his voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable authority. You are no longer a servant of Ethelgard. You will be moved to the royal wing. You will have a guard, a wardrobe, and a stipend. You are now the personal governess and sworn protector of Prince Leo. But the council, Adelaide gasped, her mind reeling. Lord Harrington, Lady Genevieve, they will never allow an Omega, a rejected— I am the king, Alaric interrupted, his eyes flashing dangerous gold. The council does not dictate my bloodline's salvation. If my son sees a mother in you, Adelaide of House Mercer, then by the goddess, you will be the mother he deserves. He paused, his gaze dropping momentarily to her lips before meeting her eyes again. and if anyone in this castle dares to disrespect you, they will answer to me." The transition from the damp, soot-stained kitchens to the opulent royal wing of Ethelgard was jarring enough to give Adelaide a permanent sense of vertigo. Her new chambers were draped in heavy emerald velvet and warmed by a hearth that never died. Her wardrobe, once consisting of 2 scratchy linen shifts, was replaced by gowns of spun silk, fine wool, and delicate lace. Yet to Adelaide, the beautiful clothes felt like a gilded cage. She was an omega surrounded by apex predators, waiting for the illusion to shatter. But Prince Leo anchored her to reality. Since the night of the solstice, the little prince refused to leave her side. Though he had not spoken another word since that earth-shattering mummer, his silence was no longer empty. It was communicative. He communicated through the tight grip of his small hand in hers, the way he would bury his face in her skirts when strangers approached, and the soft rumbling purr he made when she read him tales of the first wolves by the firelight. King Alaric, true to his word, had placed a fortress of protection around them. Captain Silas, the towering, battle-scarred beta, was assigned as their personal shadow. When Adelaide walked the castle gardens with Leo, Silas trailed 10 paces behind, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his broad sword. The court was seething. In the opulent drawing rooms of the western wing, Lady Genevieve Beaumont paced like a caged lioness. Her betrothal to the king had been a foregone conclusion, a political alliance meticulously crafted by Lord Harrington to secure the northern borders. Now she was being sidelined by a nameless, rejected scullery maid. "It is an abomination, Alistair," Genevieve hissed, pouring a generous measure of fortified wine into a crystal glass. She handed it to Lord Alistair, a calculating, sharp-featured alpha, who served as Harrington's chief whisperer. The king invites her to dine at the lower high table. He looks at her with an indulgence he has never shown me. An omega, a rejected, broken plaything of the Ironwood pack. Lord Alistair swirled the wine, his eyes glinting dangerously. "Patience, Genevieve. King Alaric is driven by his love for the boy. The Omega is merely a tool to coax the prince out of his shell. But tools can break, or more accurately, they can prove themselves defective." Genevieve stopped pacing, her crimson lips curving into a cruel smile. "Go on." "The king prizes strength and competence above all," Alistair murmured smoothly. "If this Adelaide were to endanger the prince, say through gross negligence or a tragic accident, the king's protective instincts would turn on her in an instant. She would be banished or executed, and you would step in to comfort the grieving father." Genevieve's eyes lit up with malicious delight. She summoned her senior lady-in-waiting, a bitter beta named Rosalind, who had long resented the royal family for passing over her own brother for a knighthood. "Rosalind," Genevieve said softly, reaching into a locked mahogany box on her vanity and withdrawing a small, dark glass vial. "You are in charge of the midday pastries sent to the royal gardens, are you not?" The plot was set into motion on a crisp, cloudless Tuesday. Adelaide was sitting on a stone bench beneath a sprawling willow tree, weaving a crown of winter-blooming jasmine for Leo. The little prince was chasing a stray tortoise-shell cat through the frosted rose bushes. Rosalind approached, accompanied by 2 lower servants carrying silver trays of candied fruits, cold meats, and small lemon cakes glazed in honey. "Compliments of the kitchens, Lady Adelaide," Rosalind said, her voice dripping with mock deference. She set a plate containing a single, beautifully decorated lemon cake, perfectly on the edge of the stone table, closest to where Leo was playing. "Thank you, Rosalind," Adelaide replied politely, though her inner wolf stirred uneasily. There was a sharpness to Rosalind's scent, sour sweat and adrenaline, that contradicted her calm demeanor. Leo, spotting the sweets, abandoned the cat and trotted over, his eyes wide. He reached his chubby, dirt-streaked hand toward the honey-glazed cake. Adelaide smiled, reaching out to cut it for him. But as she leaned over the pastry, a scent hit her like a physical blow. Before her exile, Adelaide had spent years studying the flora of the deep woods. As an Omega, her sense of smell was acutely tuned to subtle shifts in earth and plant life. Beneath the overpowering sweetness of the lemon and honey, there was a faint, metallic bitterness. It smelled like wet copper and crushed dark earth. Aconitum. Wolfsbane. Time seemed to slow. Leo's fingers were mere inches from the pastry. "No!" Adelaide shrieked. Operating on pure, terrifying instinct, she lunged forward, slapping the silver plate with all her might. The heavy platter flipped, sending the poisoned cake flying into the dirt, smashing the fine porcelain into a dozen jagged pieces. Leo let out a startled gasp, stumbling backward and landing hard on his bottom. He looked at the ruined cake, then up at Adelaide, his lower lip trembling. "What is the meaning of this?" Rosalind shouted, taking a dramatic step back. "Have you gone mad, Omega? You struck the prince's food." Captain Silas, who had been standing by the courtyard gate, was there in a heartbeat, his sword half drawn. "Adelaide, are you unharmed?" Adelaide ignored them all. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, frantically pulling Leo into her arms, checking his mouth, his hands, terrified he had touched it. "I'm sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry," she babbled, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned to Silas, her blue eyes wide with terror and fury. "Do not let the hounds near that cake, and do not let her leave." She pointed a shaking finger at the pale, suddenly trembling Rosalind. "There is wolfsbane in the glaze." The king's wrath was a living, breathing entity that consumed the castle. Within the hour, King Alaric had descended upon the royal apothecary, where the court physician confirmed Adelaide's horrifying accusation. The lemon cake contained enough concentrated wolfsbane to stop a child's heart in minutes. The interrogation of Rosalind did not last long. Under the terrifying, suffocating pressure of Alaric's alpha aura, the lady-in-waiting cracked. Weeping hysterically, she confessed to lacing the cake, but fiercely maintained she acted alone out of spite, terrified of implicating Lady Genevieve and facing Lord Harrington's assassins. Alaric banished Rosalind to the brutal labour camps of the salt mines, a fate many considered worse than death. But the king was not a fool. He knew a minor beta lady-in-waiting did not have the means or the audacity to orchestrate the assassination of the crown prince. The rot went deeper. That night, a violent thunderstorm rolled over the northern valleys, mirroring the king's turbulent mind. Rain lashed against the stained glass windows of Alaric's private chambers. Adelaide was seated on a plush velvet sofa near the hearth, shivering despite the roaring fire. Leo was asleep in her lap, his small hands clutching the fabric of her gown. The adrenaline of the day had faded, leaving Adelaide hollow and trembling. The reality of high court politics had crashed down upon her. She wasn't just a governess, she was a shield standing between a helpless boy and a den of vipers. The heavy oak doors opened, and King Alaric stepped in. He looked exhausted. He had shed his heavy armour, wearing only a dark linen tunic that clung to the thick, scarred musculature of his chest and arms. He dismissed the guards with a flick of his wrist and locked the door behind him. He walked over to the sofa and knelt on the thick bearskin rug directly in front of Adelaide. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at his sleeping son, gently brushing a dark curl from Leo's forehead with a massive, battle-hardened hand. Then his intense green eyes shifted up to Adelaide. "You saved his life," Alaric said, his voice a low, rough gravel that vibrated in the quiet room. The physician said the dosage was lethal. If he had taken even a single bite. Alaric closed his eyes, his jaw clenching so hard, a muscle ticked in his cheek. "I smelled it, Your Majesty," Adelaide whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "The honey masked it well. But Omegas, we are attuned to the earth. It smelled like rot. Alaric opened his eyes. He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her, and took her trembling right hand in both of his. His skin was incredibly hot. A note on lichen bonds. In the lore of the northern valleys, an alpha's touch is inherently dominant. But when an alpha touches their true mate, the heat of their skin adjusts to soothe, not command. It is a biological submission to the soul's counterpart. As Alaric's fingers wrapped around hers, a sudden, violent spark of electricity shot up Adelaide's arm. She gasped, trying to pull away, but his grip, though gentle, was immovable. Her inner wolf, which had been curled into a tight, agonizing ball of grief since Cedric's rejection 3 years ago, suddenly lifted its head. It let out a soft, questioning whimper. Alaric froze. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the green of his irises until his eyes were almost entirely black, save for a ring of molten gold. He inhaled sharply, leaning closer to her. The scent of her, which he had previously registered as subtle and sweet, suddenly bloomed in his senses. It was no longer laced with the bitter tang of a broken bond. It smelled of rain-soaked jasmine, vanilla, and the intoxicating, primal scent of home. "Goddess," Alaric breathed, the realization hitting him with the force of a warhammer. He was experiencing the rarest phenomenon in lycanthrope biology, the second-chance mate bond. The moon goddess, in her infinite, mysterious wisdom, had taken a broken omega and a grieving king and tied their frayed souls together. "Your Majesty." "Please," Adelaide whimpered, terrified of the sudden, overwhelming intensity in his eyes. The last time an alpha had looked at her with such raw, unmasked emotion, it had ended in her public destruction. "Let me go." "Never," Alaric growled softly, the word slipping out before he could stop it. He immediately softened his expression, loosening his grip slightly, though he did not let her hand go. "Adelaide, look at me." She forced her eyes up to meet his. "I am not him," Alaric vowed, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded dangerously like reverence. "I am not the fool who broke you. You are the savior of my bloodline. You are the protector of my son." He lifted her scarred, lie-burned hand and pressed a searingly gentle kiss to her knuckles. "And no one in this realm will ever harm you again. This I swear on my crown." Adelaide's breath hitched, a tear finally escaping and tracking down her pale cheek. For the first time in 3 years, she felt a dangerous, terrifying ember of hope ignite in her chest. But outside the safety of the king's locked chambers, the darkness was gathering. In the damp, echoing cellars beneath the castle's eastern wing, Lady Genevieve stood wrapped in a dark velvet cloak. Lord Harrington stood beside her, holding a flickering lantern. From the shadows, a third figure emerged. He was dressed in the rough, mud-spattered leathers of a travelling merchant, his face obscured by a thick cowl. But as he stepped into the dim light of the lantern, he pulled the hood back, revealing the arrogant, bearded face of Lord Cedric of the Ironwood Pack. "You took a terrible risk coming back here, Cedric," Lord Harrington sneered. "If the king's patrols catch you within the borders, you will be executed without trial." "I had to see it for myself," Cedric replied, his voice a low, envious snarl. "My spies told me the king has elevated my discarded trash to the royal wing, that she acts as the prince's mother." "She is a nuisance," Genevieve hissed impatiently, "and she is too observant. She thwarted our little experiment today. The king is fiercely guarding her." Cedric's eyes glinted with a sickening, calculating light. "You are looking at this the wrong way, Lady Genevieve. You see an obstacle. I see an opportunity." "Explain," Harrington demanded. "Adelaide Mercer is weak, her wolf is broken. But she is fiercely loyal to those she perceives as helpless," Cedric said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "She still bears the invisible scars of my rejection. I know how to break her mind. I know how to make her question her own sanity. If we want to remove her from the king's side, we do not need poison." Cedric stepped closer to the two nobles, his scent reeking of ambition and malice. "We need to convince the king that the broken Omega has finally gone completely, violently mad, and I know exactly how to do it." The psychological warfare began subtly, a slow, creeping rot designed to unravel Adelaide's newly found sanctuary. It started with a scent. 3 nights after the Wolfsbane incident, Adelaide awoke in her heavily guarded chambers, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, monstrous shadows across the velvet drapes. The room was freezing, but it was the smell that made her blood run cold. It was the sharp, metallic stench of pine sap and old blood. Cedric's scent. "Who's there?" Adelaide whispered, clutching the thick fur blankets to her chest. She glanced at the adjoining door where Prince Leo slept soundly, undisturbed. Silence answered her. Adelaide forced herself out of bed, her bare feet hitting the icy stone floor. She checked the heavy iron locks on the oak doors. They were untouched. Captain Silas was stationed right outside. It was impossible for anyone to have entered. Yet, when she walked back to her bed, she found a single, withered branch of an ironwood tree resting perfectly on her pillow. Over the next 2 weeks, the torment escalated. Adelaide began hearing Cedric's low, mocking laughter echoing in the empty corridors of the royal wing. She found her silk gowns slashed to ribbons in her armoire. During a heavily guarded walk in the snowy gardens, she suffered a violent panic attack, collapsing to her knees and screaming that she was being hunted by ironwood hounds, though Silas and the guards saw nothing but empty white courtyards. Lady Genevieve seized the opportunity with venomous glee. "The Omega is fracturing, Alaric," Genevieve murmured softly during a royal council meeting, placing a perfectly manicured hand on the king's arm. "It is a tragedy, truly. But a broken mind cannot be trusted near the crown prince. Her delusions are making her erratic. Yesterday, she nearly dropped Leo down the grand staircase because she claimed to see a ghost." King Alaric pulled his arm away from Genevieve, his green eyes dark and tempestuous. He knew Adelaide was suffering, but his newly awakened, terrifyingly possessive alpha instincts roared at him to protect her, not discard her. He spent his nights sitting in the armchair of her chambers, watching her sleep, his mere presence the only thing that kept her nightmares at bay. He had the castle scoured from the battlements to the dungeons, but whoever was orchestrating this left no physical trace. The breaking point arrived at the grand gathering of the Winter Court. Lords and ladies from all across the northern valleys, including the formidable Lord Reginald of the Southern Isles, had travelled to Ethelgard to renew their fealty to the king. The great hall was packed with hundreds of nobles, shimmering in jewels and thick furs. Adelaide was seated on a lower dais near the king's high table, dressed in a breathtaking gown of midnight blue, with Leo perched securely on her lap. Despite the elegance of her surroundings, she looked pale and haunted, dark circles bruising the skin beneath her eyes. Lord Harrington stepped forward to present the final petition of the evening. Behind him, flanked by heavily armoured mercenaries, walked a tall man draped in a heavy, hooded travelling cloak. "My king," Harrington announced, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "A minor lord seeks a royal pardon. He claims he was unjustly banished and wishes to present his case under the sacred guest right of the Winter Court." Alaric leaned forward on his throne, his jaw clenching. "Uncloak him." The man reached up and pulled back his hood. Gasps erupted throughout the hall. It was Lord Cedric. Before Alaric could even draw a breath to order his execution, Cedric locked eyes with Adelaide. He didn't speak to the king. He spoke directly to the terrified Omega, using a dark, forbidden blood magic he had purchased from the Bogland witches to amplify his voice. It struck Adelaide like a physical blow. "Did you really think you could escape me, little bird?" Cedric's voice echoed unnaturally, vibrating in the very marrow of her bones. "You are broken. You are nothing. Kneel." The remnants of their severed bond, manipulated by the dark magic, flared with agonizing pain. Adelaide let out a blood-curdling scream, clapping her hands over her ears. She dropped to the stone floor, curling into a tight ball, trembling violently as the phantom pain of rejection ripped through her chest all over again. Leo, terrified by her sudden collapse, clung to her desperately, crying out in silent panic. "Look at her!" Lady Genevieve shrieked from the high table, pointing a dramatic finger at Adelaide. "She is feral. She is crushing the prince. Guards, seize the madwoman before she kills him." Treason did not announce itself with a trumpet's blare. It exploded into the great hall with the deafening shatter of stained glass and the sickening scrape of drawn steel. As Adelaide collapsed onto the cold stone floor of the lower dais, her screams tearing through the festive air, Lord Harrington's mercenaries shed their heavy cloaks. There were 24 of them, hardened killers from the lawless eastern fringes, their armor completely unmarked by any noble house. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, forming a jagged wall of pikes and broad swords between the high table and the writhing Omega. "Hold the king!" Lord Harrington shrieked, his pristine velvet robes swishing as he scrambled backward behind the line of mercenaries. "The Alpha King is compromised by madness. Secure the Crown Prince!" "Treason!" roared Lord Reginald of the Southern Isles, overturning a massive feasting table to create a makeshift barricade for his family. Panic erupted. Hundreds of nobles scattered like frightened deer, their jewels flashing in the candlelight as they clawed at the heavy oak doors, only to find them barred from the outside by Harrington's loyalists. King Alaric did not speak. A pure, unadulterated alpha roar ripped from his chest, a sound so primal and violently loud that the massive iron chandeliers above them groaned on their chains. His golden eyes bled into absolute black, his canines elongating as his inner wolf seized the reins. He did not bother with the stairs of the dais. He vaulted directly over the high table, his heavy broadsword clearing its scabbard in a blur of deadly silver. Captain Silas was a half-second behind him, his battle-axe swinging in a deadly arc that instantly shattered the line of mercenaries. The clash of steel was deafening, the smell of roasted meats and spiced wine immediately overtaken by the sharp, coppery stench of freshly spilled blood. Alaric fought like a demon pulled straight from the underworld, his blade carving through armor and bone with terrifying ease. He was a force of nature, driven by the frantic, agonizing pulse of the second-chance mate bond, screaming in his blood. Protect her. Protect the pup. But they were 30 yards away from the lower dais, bogged down by a sea of heavily armed killers, and Cedric of the Ironwood was already there. Cedric's dark magic, purchased at a steep price from the exiled Bogland witches, was doing its gruesome work. It functioned as a metaphysical meat hook, catching on the ragged, unhealed edges of Adelaide's severed mate bond and tearing it wide open. Adelaide lay curled on the stone, her silk gown pooled around her, gasping for air that her lungs refused to take. The phantom pain was blinding. She felt the public humiliation of 3 years ago washing over her, the crushing weight of being declared worthless, weak, and utterly broken. Her vision swam with dark spots. She was drowning in the echoes of Cedric's cruelty. Through the haze of her agony, she felt small, frantic hands tugging at her bodice. Prince Leo was kneeling beside her, his tiny face pale with absolute terror. He wasn't crying, but his chest heaved with silent, panicked sobs. He looked from Adelaide's convulsing form to the towering, leather-clad figure of Cedric, stepping over the ruined tables toward them. "Give me the boy, you broken wretch," Cedric snarled, a triumphant, ugly sneer twisting his bearded face. He reached down, his massive hand aiming to rip the 4-year-old prince from Adelaide's weak grasp. "You are too pathetic to bear my pups, and you are too weak to raise this one. The kingdom belongs to the strong. As Cedric's heavy fingers clamped down brutally on Leo's fragile shoulder, the little prince dug his heels into the stone floor. He squeezed his green eyes tightly shut, his small jaw locking in the exact, stubborn way his father's did. He drew in a massive breath, and the silence that had imprisoned him for 4 years shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "No!" The word tore from the boy's throat, loud, desperate, and ringing with the unmistakable budding authority of royal alpha blood. That single syllable struck Adelaide's soul like a strike of pure lightning. The suffocating fog of Cedric's dark magic incinerated in an instant, burned away by something ancient and infinitely more powerful. The agonizing ache of her broken bond vanished. In its place, a dormant, terrifying power roared to life within her very marrow. Lycanthrope lore spoke in hushed, reverent whispers of a rare biological anomaly, the true Luna. While an alpha ruled through dominance and force, a true Luna ruled through the absolute, unyielding power of the pack's heart. It was an omega whose maternal instinct was so fiercely protective that when her pup was threatened, she could bend the will of nature itself. Adelaide's head snapped up. The tears streaking her face evaporated. Her eyes were no longer a pale, submissive blue. They were glowing with a blinding, incandescent silver light, brilliant as a full moon reflecting off a frozen lake. Cedric froze, the sneer melting off his face as the temperature in the great hall plummeted. The fires in the massive hearths flickered and died. An aura of pure, crushing pressure exploded from the small woman on the floor. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating dominance of an alpha. It was a sharp, piercing cold that demanded absolute, biological reverence. Every wolf in the room, from the fleeing nobles to the blood-soaked mercenaries, felt the sudden urge to bare their throats in submission. "Take your hands off my son," Adelaide commanded. Her voice did not shake. It resonated with a terrifying layered depth, echoing through the massive vaulted ceilings. It was the voice of the moon goddess channeling her wrath through a mortal vessel. Cedric's eyes widened in sheer, paralyzing terror. His inner wolf, suddenly realizing it was standing before an apex predator of divine right, forced him to release the boy. He stumbled backward, tripping over a silver platter, his hands raised in pathetic defense. "Well, what are you?" he stammered, the dark magic completely broken. Adelaide stood up smoothly. The midnight blue silk of her gown rustled like thunder. She pulled Leo safely behind her skirts, standing between the crown prince and his attacker. She did not cower. She stepped forward, the silver light in her eyes blazing, and delivered a devastating, open-handed strike across Cedric's face. The sickening crack of his jaw shattering echoed like a cannon shot in the sudden silence of the hall. The sheer force of the true Luna's blow lifted the massive alpha entirely off his feet. Cedric crashed violently into the stone pillars, splintering ancient wood and collapsing into a heap of broken bones and groans. Absolute, breathless silence slammed down on Ethelgard. No one moved. A rejected, supposedly broken Omega had just physically overpowered and struck down an Alpha Pack leader with a single blow. King Alaric stood 30 feet away, his broad sword dripping with the blood of the mercenaries who had instantly dropped their weapons at Adelaide's command. His chest heaved, his golden eyes fixed on the magnificent, terrifying creature standing over Cedric, the second chance mate bond between them fully synchronized, a burning tether of unbreakable steel wrapping around his heart. Alaric did not issue a command. He did not shout for his guards. In front of hundreds of astounded, trembling nobles, the most feared Alpha King in the known realms dropped his sword to the blood-stained stones and fell to one knee before the Omega. "My queen," Alaric rumbled, his voice thick with absolute, breathless devotion. Lord Harrington tried to crawl toward the eastern doors, whimpering in fear. but Captain Silas placed a heavy, iron-shod boot firmly on the elder's back, pinning him to the floor. Up on the high table, Lady Genevieve collapsed into her ornate chair, her face ashen, realizing with horrifying clarity that she had completely miscalculated the board. Alaric stood slowly, his terrible, lethal wrath returning as he looked down at Cedric's broken form. He retrieved his broadsword, the steel glinting menacingly in the pale moonlight streaming through the shattered windows. Lord Cedric of the Ironwood, Alaric's voice, was the sound of a closing tomb. You broke your banishment, you conspired with traitors, and you laid hands upon the crown prince and my true mate. There will be no pardon. The execution was swift, brutal, and absolute. The rebellion of the Winter Court was drowned in blood before it ever truly began. The winter storms eventually broke, giving way to the soft, golden light of a northern spring. Ethelgard Castle, once a fortress of silent grief, now echoed with life. Adelaide of House Mercer was crowned queen in the very hall where she had once scrubbed the floors, wearing a diadem of silver wolves that matched the blazing power of her eyes. She proved that true strength was not found in the brute force of an alpha, but in the unbreakable spirit of a mother's love. As King Alaric stood beside her on the grand balcony, overlooking their prosperous lands, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, a small boy tugged on the hem of Adelaide's velvet cloak. Prince Leo looked up, his green eyes bright and fearless, and spoke a full, flawless sentence for the realm to hear. "Mama, can we go to the gardens now?"